Yes, Mr. Millett. Now then.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, members of the panel. I now call Commissioner Andrew Rowe, please.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Rowe. I gather you're going to take the oath.
I am, thank you, Chair.
Right, there should be a testament there, is there?
There is indeed.
Take it in your right hand, please, and read the words on the screen.
I swear by Almighty God that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much. Please sit down and make yourself comfortable. Yes, Mr. Millett.
Yes.
You're ready.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, thank you. Commissioner, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Thank you very much for attending once again to assist the inquiry at this phase 2 of our investigations. We are extremely grateful to you. My questions are intended to be short and simple. Sometimes they aren't. And so if you would like me to repeat the question or put it in a different way, I can do that. We will take breaks in the normal scheduled way, halfway through the afternoon and during tomorrow, during the morning, and if we get to the afternoon, during the afternoon as well. Can I ask you to keep your voice up so that the person who sits to your right can get down onto the transcript everything you're saying clearly? It also helps, please, if you don't nod or shake your head. Yes or no is necessary, as the case may be. Now, you've provided 2 Rule 9 witness statements to the inquiry for the purposes of our Phase 2 investigations. And you've also made a number of statements for our Phase 1 investigations, which I will not be looking at with you. Can I show you the first of your Phase 2 Rule 9 statements? That is at LFB 3060655. It's dated the 14th of June 2019, and that's the first page. If we look at the last page, page 29, you'll see a signature. Is that your signature?
I can't see it yet on my screen, I'm afraid. Apologies.
It's coming up.
Is that your signature? Yes.
Thank you, that is my signature.
Right. Is that your... Thank you. And your second Rule 9 statement is at LFB 000083834. That's the first page of it. You'll see it's dated the 6th of December 2019. If we go to page 15, do you see a signature there above the date, 6th December 2019? Is that your signature?
Yes, that is my signature.
Now, both those statements exhibit a number of documents, don't they?
They do indeed.
Have you read both of these witness statements recently?
I have.
And have you read the exhibits recently?
I have.
Are you happy for the content of those statements to stand as your evidence to the inquiry?
I do.
And have you discussed your evidence with anybody before coming here today?
Only my legal team.
Yes. Now, I'm going to ask you first about the various roles and positions that you occupied, both inside and outside the LFB, before you became the LFB's Commissioner in January 2020. Is it right that you served in the British Army between 1996 and 2000?
Yes, it is.
And that was in the Royal Regiment of Artillery, I think.
Yes, it was.
And by the time you left the Army, you held the rank of captain, didn't you?
I did.
And I think you tell us that you were second in command of a battery of about 120 personnel.
That's correct.
And you also had active experience of operational tours in Northern Ireland in 1998, where you were part of the response, among other things, to the Omagh bombings.
That is correct.
Yes. And then you joined the London Fire Brigade in 2002.
Yes, that's correct.
And that was as an operational firefighter.
As an operational firefighter.
Yes, and after that I think you became group manager in operational policy, rising up through the ranks in 2012.
That's correct.
And overlapping with the same period, you were a member of the Operational Review Team, or the ORT, from 2010 to 2015.
That is also correct.
And then, correct me if this is wrong, but you became Deputy Assistant Commissioner, DAC, in February 2016. Yes?
That is correct.
And in that capacity, I think you acted as Incident Commander at the Croydon tram crash.
That is also correct.
Yes, and that was the same year, I think.
Yes, it was,
yes.
Yeah.
And you were then made Assistant Commissioner in April 2017, yes?
Yes, that is correct.
And it was as Assistant Commissioner that you attended and indeed acted as Incident Commander at the Grenfell Tower fire on the 14th of June 2017.
That is correct.
Yes. And after that fire, you were made Deputy Commissioner and Director of Operations from November 2019.
That is correct.
And finally then appointed Commissioner in January 2020.
That is also correct.
Thank you. Now, we've called you to give evidence at this point in the inquiry, Commissioner, at the end of Module 5 and at the end of the first part of Module 6. because you are the present London Fire Commissioner, and as such you are the individual carrying the responsibility for assuring Londoners that they are being kept safe by the Brigade. Do you understand that?
I do understand that. I hold that responsibility fully.
And we would like to hear from you because as Commissioner you have certain insights and certain perspectives, some of which you have shared publicly in the press, I think, haven't you?
Indeed, yes.
Yes. Now, at heart, I have really two questions for you, and possibly a third. I don't want you to answer them straight away. I pose them now so that you can address them as we go through your evidence and perhaps revisit them at the end. And those questions are these. The first one is, are you able to explain why the LFB failed to learn all the lessons from the Lakenal House fire in July 2009, despite the effort and the resources invested in doing so between that year and 2017? That's the first question. The second question we have for you is, has the LFB asked itself the question I've just asked you? In other words, as well as trying to learn the lessons of Grenfell and carrying out the recommendations in the Chairman's Phase 1 report, has the LFB asked itself why its response to the Lakenal fire was defective in so many respects? And the third question arises perhaps from the second, which is, what has the LFB learned about itself as an organisation from its failure to learn from the Lakenal House fire? Now, those questions have embedded in them some factual assumptions, which we will explore together during the course of your evidence. But those are essentially the questions that I have for you. Do you understand what I'm asking you?
I do understand what you're asking me, Mr. Minute. Thank you.
And you accept, I think, and tell me if this is wrong, that it is your task as Commissioner from 2020 to answer those questions?
I think that lies at the heart of what I am responsible for.
Thank you. Can I start then by asking you about an interview you gave to the Guardian newspaper in September 2020, the 1st of September 2020. Mm-hmm. This we will find at INQ 30155028. There it is on your screen in front of you. And you can see first that the title is "We Let Grenfell Tower Residents Down, Says London Fire Chief." And the date is Tuesday, 1st of September 2020. Now, to put it into context, this was about 9 months into your term as Commissioner. And at that stage, you may recall that the inquiry phase 2 hearings were underway. We were hearing Module 1 evidence at that stage.
Yes.
Yes. Now, at that point, just to be more specific, we were approaching the end of the Module 1 hearings, which focused on the refurbishment, and we're about to start Module 2, which concerned the testing and the certification of the relevant cladding materials. Now, if you go a little bit lower down, one of the points you make in the Guardian interview is that, and if you go please to page 2, you can see in the third paragraph there, take your responsibility seriously, he said. If you have cladding on your building, work within the framework that is there to get it off as soon as possible. This is bigger than money. This is about people's lives, their mental and physical well-being. You will get my absolute support as London Fire Commissioner to do that. Now, you were addressing, I think, the corporate entities who had participated in the inquiry's Phase 2 hearings to date. There, and also, if you look at page 3 of this article, in the 4th paragraph down, you say this: "They should be ashamed," he said. "Understand that 72 people lost their lives. Now is not the time to seek corporate defence, but actually give these families what they deserve, which is the truth and an undertaking not to let history repeat itself." First, did you say the words there that are attributed to you by the article?
I think it's a paraphrase of what I said, but I think the essence of what is written is my opinion, yes.
Thank you. And as I say, I think you were addressing the corporate entities who had participated in the inquiry thus far, weren't you?
I was.
Yes. And do you agree that your words there apply with the same force to the LFB itself?
Yes, I do.
Now, there are 4 points that you make in this interview, and I would like to ask you about each of those in turn, if I can. And the first is on page 2, if we scroll back to it, 4th paragraph from the bottom. And the article says this: Rowe told The Guardian that the LFB had been, quotes, had been in, quotes, denial about systemic issues, unquotes, and said he had now embarked on a 2.5-year retraining programme for commanders, including new training on cladding fires, which had not been delivered before Grenfell. Did you say, as the article attributes to you, that the LFB was, quotes, in denial about systemic issues?
I can't remember the exact words I used, but because it was a long interview. But I know we discussed in depth, both myself and the journalist, because he asked me many questions, where I thought the roots of some of the improvements we needed to make lay.
And so do you, sitting here today, associate yourself with what this newspaper has attributed to you?
I think that the general thrust of the article is accurate. I think it reflects my opinion at the time and the opinion I hold now.
Right. Are you able to tell us what systemic issues you were referring to as attributed to you there?
Yes. So I spoke about what I thought had been an erosion not only in the London Fire Brigade but in the National Service of professional standards over a period of probably 2 decades that had started, I suppose its genesis had started with the 2003 industrial action around pay and had led to the dismantling of national structures that supported consistent national guidance, consistent assurance and inspection of fire and rescue services, had led to the removal of all sorts of things such as statutory exams, had moved to a sort of MVQ-based education system, which I don't think validated people's competency. And then, in part to the industrial relations climate, where we had seen repeated industrial disputes in London that I thought had taken the focus of decision makers away from some of the risks that had slowly built over time. So it was a long answer. It was more than just a snapshot of one sentence. We talked about what I perceived to be an erosion of standards across the National Service, and the London Fire Brigade was not immune to that.
Right. Can you help us with what you meant by denial there? How did the LFB come to be in denial about the systemic issues that you have mentioned?
I can't speak as to what people had or hadn't seen in the past, because I wasn't at a level of seniority that would necessarily have been privy to decision making at the level I now sit at. But I think what I meant by that was probably, and I think it's been exposed through this phase of the inquiry particularly, that we were aware of risks in particular that existed in the operation environment, and indeed at times trained people to those risks, but hadn't joined all the information up together. So if we think of Grenfell specifically, we knew that there was a potential risk of wholesale failure of compartmentation. We knew, for example, the dangers of poor maintenance and management of buildings, the possible large-scale involvement of utilities in a fire, the very real possibility of a very large fire in London involving loss of life. But I'm not sure that we had joined all of those things together in a way that really articulated those risks to officers in totality.
And have you, since you became Commissioner, sought to get to the bottom of the causes of the denial? Let me give you an example. Have you asked for outside professional help to understand why it was that the LFB denied what it should have accepted and acted on long before?
I mean, I think, again, I can't remember the specifics of the interview. I'm not sure denial is necessarily the right word, but it certainly not being cited on issues would be the right way to characterise this. And the answer is yes, because I think one of the most serious issues, not just for the London Fire Brigade, but again for the service nationally, was that we were simply not scrutinised effectively over a period of decades. It wasn't until the return of Her Majesty's Inspectorate that I think we began to get back to a place where good, robust external assurance was brought to bear. So it's something about bringing people in from the outside to see what you perhaps can't because you're so focused on one area of business. The answer to you, Mr. Millett, is yes, we have. So, for example, we have set up an independent audit committee that is chaired independently. I have an independent operational assurance advisor who acts totally independently of me, examines different pieces of the organisation, the former Chief Fire Officer of Scotland. We have built a completely different business assurance framework based on Treasury best practice, 3 lines of defence, because I think one of the things that has struck me from the evidence presented in this phase of the inquiry is that you cannot rely on a single line of assurance. You cannot rely simply on a line manager who's probably working very hard to the best of their ability to always see where the fault lines are and therefore escalate matters. There needs to be a second line of attack, as it were, and that's something we've brought in layers now, because as Commissioner I no longer feel in a position where I would want to rely simply on the assurance of my leaders inside the LFB to tell me that something had happened and assure me that we had delivered the right outcome.
Now, you perhaps don't associate yourself with the word denial about systemic issues. You say, instead, not being cited. What do you say is the cause, historically, of the LFB, in your words, not being cited on the systemic issues that have emerged?
I think it's complex. I don't think there's one single cause. I would go back to my first answer, which is I think there was a gradual, incremental erosion of professional standards and governance over a period of decades that was manifest because of a number of factors, whether that was the industrial relations climate, whether it was the lack of overarching national guidance, whether it was the lack of either effective national scrutiny or local assurance, a focus on other areas of risk sometimes. So, for example, post 9/11, there was a great focus on counter-terrorism, quite rightly. So there was something about how the Brigade managed its resources and the focus it brought to bear on whatever risk was presented at that point. So I think it's multi-layered, but from my point of view, having joined the service in 2002 as a firefighter, I was certainly witness at each level I was at to a gradual erosion of what I perceive to be professional standards and communication of risk and the training to support it.
Would you agree that the capacity to recognise shortcomings, not just recognising them, but the ability to do so, would be and will be crucial to the Brigade's ability to learn from the Grenfell Tower fire?
Yes, indisputably.
Just going back to the article, if I may, Commissioner, you are recorded as saying, after the quotation denial about systemic issues, that you had now embarked on a 2.5-year retraining programme for commanders, including new training on cladding fires, which had not been delivered before Grenfell. Is it fair to say that suggests that the systemic issues which are attributed to you were related to training, at least in part?
I think part of the issues were around the nature of the training we gave people. It wasn't that we hadn't trained people. I wouldn't want to give the impression that the London Fire Brigade hadn't trained generations of firefighters. I've received a lot of training in the London Fire Brigade. I think this was about how we dealt with a specific risk that was known to one part of the organisation but hadn't necessarily been effectively communicated to another part of the organisation.
Yes, I see. Now, you go on to say, if you go on in page 2 to the penultimate paragraph, that, and I'm quoting from the article, that the disaster, quotes, was foreseeable, but it wasn't in the culture to anticipate it, admitting, quotes, the fire brigade let those families down. Now, again, Commissioner, did you say the words that are attributed to you in quotation marks there?
On the point of foreseeability, I don't believe that encapsulates the totality of what I said. No, I think I gave a much more nuanced answer. In terms of the second part, I think every single major institution that should have kept those, survivors, the bereaved, the people who lived in the tower safe, let the families down. It was the most appalling example of institutional failure, I think, in recent British history, and we were part of that as well. And that was how that answer was delivered to the journalist. In terms of the nuance of the first piece, I think that the London Fire Brigade knew of every single element that made up the totality of the Grenfell Tower fire. As I've said already, we knew about the possibility of exterior cladding fires, but we hadn't communicated it effectively internally. I had been trained on the dangers of modern methods of construction. You know, as a senior officer, I had attended some very, very high-risk large fires. The Royal Marsden Hospital fire would be a good example. Very high risk, very difficult fire to resolve. So it was not beyond our imagination that something on a scale could happen involving fire in London. What I would hold to this day is that the totality, the scale, and the extremity of that failure of every single part of regulation and human behaviour that should underpin it would have been difficult to predict.
Yeah. So just focusing in on perhaps some of the key elements, do you accept, Commissioner, that the LFB had what I might call corporate knowledge, as at June 2017, of the risks posed by non-compliant facade panels in use on high-rise buildings across London?
Yes, because I think it's clear from the evidence given to this inquiry that that was the case.
And same question in respect of the risk of sudden impending fire growth that such panels can cause?
Yes.
And the risks of smoke spread beyond the compartment of origin?
Yes, probably in a different context, but yes. I mean, Lacanau itself had shown us that that was a very real possibility, and officers were aware of that.
And does it follow from that you also accept that the possibility of widespread compartmentation failure within a high-rise building, to the extent that the stay-put policy in place in such a building became untenable, was a risk that was real and known to the Brigade as at June 2017?
Yes, and I think the proof of that is in the Lacanau House case study that I certainly received not so long after the fire. It made that possibility real to me as an operational officer at a sort of middle rank at that point. It was clear to me. I think it's manifest in our response to the Shepherd's Court fire, where officers correctly identified there'd been a partial failure of compartmentation across a number of levels in the building and successfully evacuated those parts of the building that needed to be. That's a good example of officers recognising that stay put was not relevant in the totality of the building at that point. So I think it was known. I think what caught people by utter surprise, and I would include myself in the first few moments of the Grenfell Tower fire, was just the totality of it. It seemed almost unbelievable to me that we would lose an entire residential block in modern Britain. And that it still shocks me to this day. So I think it says something about all the systems and institutions that should have kept those people safe.
Does it follow from that answer that the risk of such widespread compartmentation failure leading to the untenability of the stay-put policy in such a building is a scenario, in fact, would have been a scenario at the time, that you consider that LFB's officers should have been prepared to respond to at an incident?
I think it's of note that that possibility was considered inside, for example, the National Generic Risk Assessment. That it was referred to, not in any great detail within our own high-rise and fire survival guidance policies. So I think that possibility was acknowledged. I think where we didn't do enough for our officers and crews was actually to prepare them for how they might deal with that situation should it confront them. So I think the possibility was always there. It was written down. We knew it. LFB officers were involved in it, in the thinking around it. But that didn't translate into training as to how you might address it.
Can I just ask this? I suppose the really important thing is to recognise what's happening in front of you. And my recollection of Mr. Dowden's evidence was that he was faced with a situation which he'd never experienced. It wasn't his fault. But that he didn't recognise what was going on until it had really got away. And it may be that one of the things that was required, and maybe this is something you're now doing, is to put your immediate responders, the watch manager level, in a position to recognise a serious breach of compartmentation if it's facing them.
Yeah, I mean, we've done that now. So despite the challenges of the pandemic, we've trained all 5,000 operational staff to recognise the early signs of building failure
Yeah.
and consider, despite the very real operational challenges of doing so, how they might begin to undertake an emergency evacuation. In fact, there's an exercise today, entirely coincidentally, in Paddington, testing exactly that, testing our crews as to how they might do that with all the challenges, apparent within that operation.
Thank you.
Right. Going back to your answer a little bit earlier about knowing all the elements of risk, does it follow from that and what you've told us that the cumulative effect of the known risk factors, so rapid external fire spread across a non-compliant facade with rapid internal compartmentation failure, was also known to the brigade?
Yes, I think it was. And again, although it was in a different context, Lacanau showed us that.
And is it the case that although you knew those individual elements, the brigade had simply never put them all together?
I think there had been an attempt to put them together to an extent. So if I think about, I'm aware it's been submitted as evidence. If you think about the exercise I was a facilitator for, I'd arranged the parking and the water and the exercise. To test the new high-rise policy post-Lacanau, it did foresee the possibility of partial failure of a building, a number of fire survival guidance calls beyond the 2 or 3 we probably thought would have been the maximum in the past. So I think it was not that we hadn't anticipated some of the issues that Grenfell most terribly demonstrated, but there's something about the possibility of the scale at which it might happen, the rapidity, the enormity of that failure. So I think it's fair to say that post-Lacanau, the brigade actually really did want to learn and really did want to bring into operation policies that addressed, the very real risks that fire had demonstrated.
Does it follow that the scale of the Grenfell Tower fire was foreseeable because all the elements were known and put together?
I'm not sure that it was predictable in the totality of how it presented itself. That's my genuine position. But what I would say, and this is perhaps a slightly separate point, if you wouldn't mind, is that the history of the London Fire Brigade and fire services generally shows us that there will always be another Grenfell, but it might be a 7-7, it might be a Paddington. So actually the question for me as Commissioner is, how do we prepare our people for what, in those first few minutes might appear wholly unexpected? How do we equip them to take discretionary decision-making about things we might not reasonably even have predicted might happen? Because I think we do have a duty as a fire and rescue service to do that, to recognise that in a town on this scale, with the levels of complexity and risk within it, actually there will be something we haven't thought of. I think that's a very real possibility. There will be something as Commissioner I have not thought of in terms of future risk, or my teams have not thought of. And therefore, we have a very real duty to firefighters who, in my experience, inevitably act with courage and real endeavour to prepare them for that unforeseen eventuality. I think that's a very real duty. I think there are ways of doing it, although it is difficult.
But I'm not going to ask you about things that you hadn't thought of. I'm going to ask you about things that you, the brigade, had thought of. And on this point, you've accepted that you had thought of all the different risk elements, and they were contained within the brigade, and had amalgamated them. And so my question really is, would it not follow from that you had actually, at least as an organisation, considered what the outcome would be if all of those risk elements eventuated in one incident?
I think we had, but we hadn't looked beyond the scale of perhaps what we'd experienced at Lacanau, what we'd seen actually through years of operation experience. So Shepherd's Court showed us that you could get, external fire spread, that it might be a difficult situation to resolve. I attended quite a challenging fire at Marine Court, actually, as an ORT officer, where we lost the floor. These were challenging incidents in themselves. I think our experience and our thinking around all the composite elements was there, but we had not conceived the scale of failure that we encountered at Grenfell. And I have to say, Mr. Minnitt, it still seems almost unimaginable to me. Obviously, it is a potential reality. We have witnessed it and seen it. But I'm not sure that at the point we were planning in response, we would have planned for the totality of that failure. However, we should have still prepared our people for what they might do if they did experience something on that scale.
Did the brigade have any, as a brigade, have any particular way or particular method of approaching the assessment of severity of risk, so that it would understand that there were situations where if you put one risk together with another risk, the outcome would not be arithmetical, but exponentially worse?
I think that's something we've had to develop since the Grenfell Tower fire. So we've taken a different approach to operational risk and the gathering of risk information and risk management, because I think that is a fair challenge. I think there's something about how different parts of the organisation knew about different aspects of the risk, and that there wasn't something systemic to then put that all together, and then a team dedicated to just thinking about where that might take us, possibly. Again, looking internationally perhaps for evidence. So there is almost certainly something in that.
So the next question is, why wasn't that done in the wake of the Lacknell house fire?
I couldn't explain that, I'm afraid, because I wasn't either close enough to the decision making in regard to that, nor in the part of the brigade that would have been looking at it. All I can tell you is that we have done that now. So we have established a research and development team whose job really primarily is to join up all the different bits of information that come into the brigade. We're beginning to look at international research, but that is difficult because actually there's not either a national system really to gather that information, nor international. But we're working with the Fire Research Trust and NFCC to explore how we might gather that better, with London taking a lead role.
Can you confirm then that the question I've asked you, just the last question I've asked you, is a question that you have asked yourself and the brigade in your time as Commissioner?
Yes, it sits as one of our strategic priorities. I mean, it's got a corporate strap line which is facing the future, but what that really means, sitting beneath that, is we need to be an organisation that seeks to continuously improve, is looking forward at risk rather than accepting the current situation. So an example would be we've started to see a number of fires involving battery storage, quite small fires, but on the transport network. We can see that with development of green technology and battery storage, this is going to become a larger issue. So we are beginning to research and think about what that might mean if you start to see them on a larger industrial scale in, for example, a residential setting or in an industrial setting, which is inevitably where we're going to go. So I think we've changed our approach to this, but this is cultural change as well, and it will take time to deliver those improvements.
If you just look back at the article again and the paragraph I've just read to you, which quotes you saying that the disaster, quotes, was foreseeable, but it wasn't in the culture to anticipate it. I know that you may not have used those exact words, but can we attribute the gist of those words to you, do you think?
I think it's the answer I've just given, which is that there wasn't a systemic approach to joining all the different bits of understanding around risk up inside the brigade and then presenting that back for either challenge and assurance or to firefighters, making them aware of a specific risk necessarily. Some of them, yes, but not in totality, not joined together.
The next point I want to ask you about, Commissioner, on this article is at page 3. If we turn the page to page 3 and look at the first paragraph on that page, the article says, and it attributes this to you in quotation marks, people were caught in the headlights, close quotes, Rose said, open quotes. I have the greatest sympathy for those officers because we had simply not prepared them for those circumstances, and that is what we must do now. First of all, again, did you say the words attributed to you?
Again, I think it's paraphrasing, because I spoke to Robert Booth for probably 40 minutes.
Right.
It was a very long interview piece, but I think what he's paraphrased there, I would characterise myself as being caught in the headlights that night. The experience of turning up at that incident was wholly shocking. Any officer turning up and coming round the corner and seeing that in front of them, would at that point have felt under immense pressure, faced with what I've got no doubt, because I know the individuals concerned, would have been the most challenging incident of their operational careers. They'd have seen that instantly. And in terms of preparation, I think that whilst I'd been trained repeatedly for command, if I was to think about comparative industries, my own experiences in the army, I think there is a level of investment, for example, in armed policing, public order policing and the military, that is different from that in both the National Fire Service and the London Fire Brigade. I think there has been a narrative in the service about how, because fires are declining, in a way fire is solved. Well, fire is not solved. We still attend 100,000 incidents a year in London. I had 128 firefighters injured over the course of the previous year. So I think there's been a narrative in the national service and indeed in London that actually we were solving the problem. And I don't think we had put people under the sort of simulated pressure we needed to repeatedly to give them that taste of what it might be like to turn up to something that actually was unanticipated, was really difficult, was a shock. And I'd certainly had that done to me in another operational environment. I think that was something different.
Coming out of that answer, you mentioned declining numbers. Do you have any thoughts or approach about the validity of using statistical frequency of fires when it comes to preparing the brigade for incidents, having in mind that an assessment of risk involves understanding both frequency and severity?
Yeah, I think there's two parts to this answer. The first I would say is actually the less you attend fires, the more you have to train. I think it's that straightforward because you're gaining less experiential kind of learning. So actually there's a direct correlation there, funnily enough, between the less you attend, the more you've got to train. And I think although we are attending less fires, I mean, it's not a huge decline, but it is slowly declining. We are experiencing in the London environment increasingly complex fires, fires involving modern methods of construction. Therefore, it's important that firefighters are skilled and officers are skilled correctly, which again places an emphasis back onto training and the quality of training to respond. So I wouldn't use statistics in entirety to define our training approach. It's going to tell you part of the story, and then you've got to look at the specific risks themselves as to the kind of syllabus that we would expect a firefighter or an officer to work to. But as a general point, the point I'd made in that article was that I think one of the areas that, although I had received training, it would be wrong to say I hadn't. I'd had command training, I'd been tested. I think it's something that we've come back to since. So, for example, we validate competency now on a yearly basis, like a driving test for operational command, and I think we could still improve, because I think it's important to place officers under that pressure on a repeated cycle.
Just to look at the wording in the article for a moment, you say, or are said to have said, that we had simply not prepared them for those circumstances. Specifically, what circumstances were you referring to? Were you referring to a whole building fire or a cladding fire on a high-rise? Or
it was a much more general comment, really, which is why I've just answered the previous question that way, because I think what I was referring to there is the shock of turning up to something that is of a scale and an extremity. And I suppose that is really personally important to me because of the nature of my own operational career. I had been prepared as a soldier that I might be shot at and blown up. Both of those things have happened to me. They were entirely shocking, despite the very good preparation I'd received. I'd been told as a firefighter, and trained well actually, if I think about my initial recruit training, 20 weeks, about the possibility of failure on the transport system. Within a year of being a firefighter, I was the first firefighter on the platform at the Chancery Lane derailment. I knew that I might face a derailment, but the shock of actually seeing a grossly distorted tube train on the black platform stays with me to this day. So for me, it was about how we really spelled out to officers and crews, there are going to be times in your career where, despite what we might have instructed you in, despite the fact we may have got the preparation right and told you that there could be a transport disaster or a very large fire or a terrorist attack. When you actually get there, you must prepare yourself for the shock of the encounter and the ability to take yourself very quickly to a much calmer place of decision making and analysis of risk, sometimes operating outside of available guidance. And that shouldn't be something that was an add-on, but should sit at the heart of what an emergency service does in training its individuals, that mindset, that preparation for kind of experiencing stress. Because I think if I was to point to one piece of training I think we could have delivered better over the course of my London Fire Brigade career, it would be that. And I feel that because I had certainly experienced a much more explicit approach to that in the military, where people told you simply will not think of all the factors you think you're going to encounter. When this happens, you're going to be shocked. Here is some strategies for calming yourself down and beginning to take effective decisions, for example.
We'll come to the decision-making model and the DCP later in your evidence. Just on this, though, given the experience of Lakanal in 2009 as a defining learning moment for the brigade, and the vast amount of attention and resources that appear to have been directed at learning the lessons of Lakanal in the years after, are you able to tell us now in simple terms why those lessons weren't learnt and so many mistakes made at Lakanal were doomed to be repeated at Grenfell?
I think very simply there's a lesson in there about how you sustain learning. So I think the brigade did want to learn. It felt that responsibility for the bereaved from Lakanal and its own firefighters who had been, it was a terrible incident to have responded to. But there is a lesson in there about how you assure yourself that you've delivered the outcome you think you have, and then how you sustain that change so the learning is carried forward. That would be the point I would focus on.
We'll come to the specific recommendations of the coroner from the Lakanal House inquest in more detail shortly, but in broad terms, Commissioner, would you agree that proper compliance, full compliance with those recommendations would have gone a long way to improve the operational response at Grenfell and the command response in particular?
I think that the lessons we learned at Lakanal were directly relatable to what we experienced at Grenfell, and if we had sustained that learning, so for example if we had continued to make the case study available, if we had brought forward some of the training packages related to it in good time, it may have made a difference. But I would go back to the fact that at the point people arrived at that incident, the speed with which the fire developed, the extremity of it and the totality of the failure made everything extremely difficult in terms of decision making. So I have, like I said in the article, I have real sympathy for the officers who arrived at that incident in the early stages, because it would have, I imagine, have felt overwhelming in terms of the scale and the rapidity of the fire spread and the unusual nature by which it was spreading.
Can I, finally on this article, can I take you to the top of page 3, second paragraph there, where you say this, or you are said to have said this, quotation marks, "What I need to bring forward is a more confident cadre of officers who take decisions with discretion, knowing the organisation is going to back them, not being completely bound by policy and procedure, reacting intelligently to what's in front of them." Again, Commissioner, did you say the words that the article attributes to you?
Again, I think it's paraphrased, but I would hold by that intent, yes.
Is it your view that there's a problem within the brigade, or was before Grenfell, with senior officers not having sufficient confidence in their own actions, in their own decisions?
Not at the most senior level. So if I look at our AC cadre, for example, these are the most experienced operational officers in the UK fire service. If we turn to people like Andy Bell, who's known to the inquiry, he will have attended multiple 15 pump, 20 pump, potentially even 30 pump fires. It's the busiest operational environment in the UK. If I look across any of my AC colleagues, these are people I've stood shoulder to shoulder at some of the most challenging incidents, in recent UK history. So I don't think it's necessarily a question of experience. There's something in the culture of how we have trained officers in the past that I think didn't always best empower them to take decisions outside of policy. For example, we recognised that discretionary decision making might be necessary. It's there in our operational risk assessment policy, but I'm afraid we did not train people as to how they might employ it.
So when you refer to a more confident cadre of officers, at what level of officer were you referring?
I think officers at the most junior level, which is what we've begun to address. So again, I'd never had any face-to-face leadership training in my years in the London Fire Brigade. We're now delivering the largest face-to-face leadership training programme in the history of the brigade. I think that confidence is not just related to your operational decision making, but your understanding of the moral and ethical dimensions of decision making as well, for example. So I think it starts at the most junior level, because I think the most junior level are the most exposed when they turn up to an incident. They're dealing with the most chaotic and dynamic elements of an incident. Therefore, they deserve our greatest support. They're holding the greatest risk. So I think it's that cadre of officers, and as they move up through the middle layers of leadership, actually, as people become more senior, they will generally have done years and years and years of operational response and grown experience and confidence. But for a 22-year-old leading firefighter experiencing their first 8-pump fire, that's a very challenging experience, and it's there where we need to ensure that the right lessons around confident decision making, knowing they have the support of the organisation, is embedded.
Let's look at SMC 6011, please. I'll show you the first page, Commissioner. This is the HMICFRS inspection report for the LFB for the years 2018 to 19, as you can see from the first page there. And if we go to page 22, under the heading Command, about 3/4 of the way down the page, there's a paragraph that says, "We were told," starts, "We were told." Can you see that?
Yes.
We were told that organisational culture inhibits commanders from using operational discretion. Incident commanders aren't confident that the brigade would support them in using operational discretion. Moreover, not all staff feel that the tone of the brigade's post-incident debrief meetings, which review such decisions, supports a learning environment. When you gave your article, your interview, which produced the article in The Guardian, were you referring to that finding in this report?
Yes.
You were?
Because I think it's accurate.
Yes. It's right, I think, then, I'd invite you to accept this, that operational discretion is a specific operational concept that empowers or perhaps enables commanders to divert from operational policy if and when the need arises.
Yes, with a view to come back into, the safer framework of recognised policy at the earliest opportunity.
Yeah. And was the point that you were making, or the gist of the point that you were making in the article, that it's not so much the policies, but the character and the training of the people making incident command decisions that matter?
Yes, and I would like to emphasise that I think we've got the highest quality people in the fire brigade, but again, I think for multiple reasons, a culture developed where there is an element of fear about taking decisions on the incident ground, that the fear that they might be somehow punished in debriefs, although there actually isn't necessarily a mechanism to do so, but a culture had permeated where people felt they were under scrutiny, which is necessary, but not in a way that was supportive. I'd certainly experienced that, and I'd seen it. I'd seen that fear in incident commanders when I was an ORT officer responsible for providing advice, guidance, support, but also gathering, learning and debriefing people. It's been there a long time. And I think, again, that the roots of it lie, good 20 years back through the development of how we assured ourselves at incidents, the approach we took, a slightly old-fashioned approach, slightly sort of clipboard and marking people, as it were. And although I think we're a very, very long way from that now, and I think we've been a long way from it for quite a long time, the culture of the brigade is that people stay for a very long time and they have memories of what was as much as what is. So I would recognise that our own staff have told the inspectorate that it would be incoherent not to listen to them.
Would you also agree with this, that if officers are not equipped with the relevant knowledge to begin with, and to use Grenfell as an example only, knowledge about the risks posed by certain construction materials or modern methods of construction, the problem is more than a lack of confidence, it's rather a lack of technical information and expertise?
That will have something to bear on their decision making. Obviously, if you don't know why something's going wrong, or if you don't understand, why something is happening, you will not necessarily make effective decisions around it. What I would say, though, in regards to the Grenfell Tower fire, and I think I'm an example, having turned up on the night and recognised very quickly what had occurred, was that a lot of those elements had been given to operational officers and crews. We just hadn't joined it all together. So turning up, I knew that there was the possibility of, modern materials causing fire spread. I was really aware of Lakanal because I'd run Southwark Fire Station not long after the fire, and I'd seen what had happened there. It was in that borough. So I was able to piece that information together quite quickly. I think we've quite often given people lots and lots of the bits of information they need, actually, in the London Fire Brigade. But it's about creating the mindset where you think laterally and join them up. And I think you can't assume people are just going to do that. I think again, that's where you need to address training. You need to say, how do you apply learning from a different context in whatever situation you find yourself in?
Can I ask, when you turned up at the Grenfell fire, had you seen the presentation which the fire safety department had put together on tall building facade fires in other countries?
No, I hadn't.
Just wondered whether it would have helped you to recognise what was going on, although actually it sounds like you did recognise what was going on.
I think it's not just me. I don't think I'm unique. Particularly in RT, I work with a lot of experienced officers who would recognise that whether it's cladding, facade systems, scaffold scrim, vertical gardens, I had a strange fire prior to Grenfell where plaster had been sprayed onto mesh and the fire had spread beneath the plaster. That was very confusing, actually. It took us quite a while at the fire to work out what had happened there. That was not something, again, we'd necessarily encountered, but was then fed into the modern methods of construction piece. I genuinely think that night is an example of what happens when people are in shock and have to make decisions. I think many of the elements of the fire were known to officers who arrived at the fire, but it was their ability under pressure to join that information up and make decisions, employing lateral thought. And actually I had the benefit, frankly, of turning up at a point where much of this was very, very obvious in a way that might not have been so obvious at the start of the fire. And I had the benefit, because of my seniority, of having experienced many other operational incidents and having a bit of time and space to make the decision because things were already happening, I guess.
Yes. Taking the cadre of officers that you were referring to, so with great respect to you, not you, but more junior officers, would you accept that you can't expect such officers to act with confidence when they lack necessary information that would enable them to understand why a fire is behaving in the way that it is, or what it is that is burning and why it's burning the way it is?
No, I would accept that. But what I would say, in kind of caveat to that, is if you provide people with the right training, they're prepared firstly to take a decision quickly, but then reappraise that decision. And they're constantly monitoring. So much of decision making is around developing situational awareness. So if you employ a strategy at a fire and it's not working, even if you've never encountered those circumstances before, and I've found myself in this place in multiple incidents, you reappraise the situation. You will change your tactics. You need to be inquisitive. For me, that is equally important, because I think the nature of fire is, whilst that base knowledge, you're absolutely correct, Mr. Millett, is very important, actually, the ability to adapt and flex with what you're seeing in front of you because of the very nature of fire is equally important.
Well, that's helpful, and we'll come on to look a little bit more closely at some of the learning on this. Now, you may have heard or may have read the evidence of Professor Jose Torrero at Module 5 in this inquiry. You may recall that one of the criticisms he makes of the Brigade, and I'm summarising his evidence, so forgive me, but is that training within the fire and rescue sector favours what he calls plan execution, so carrying out of protocol, if you like, in accordance with standardised procedures, over plan formulation. In other words, the ability to conduct a dynamic risk assessment to come up with a plan that is specific to the particular circumstances of the incident. Would you agree with that criticism?
In part.
Which part would you not agree with?
I think that's not that doesn't represent the entirety of certainly the LFB's approach and the Fire and Rescue Services approach generally. I think Fire and Rescue Services recognise, by the nature of being an emergency service, that while standard operating procedures are important, the ability to deviate from them, to use a plan formulation approach is recognised. It actually sits at the heart of things like the decision-making model, the DCP, the kind of process by which you might consider whether a standard operating procedure actually fits at that point. And whilst I don't think we supported firefighters enough in the past to take those decisions, it's clear there is that mindset there, because it is referenced and has been for a long time in our own policies and procedures, and that's mirrored across most of the fire and rescue services in the country. So I think he's correct in that traditionally there's been an approach to reliance on SOPs, which I still think is important, by the way. You need to give people boundaries, framework, the knowledge and understanding you refer to, but it's how you then use that in decision making. I think it's important. As fire and rescue services, I think we recognise you need to be able to adapt and flex, but there's something in the culture that hasn't best enabled that at times.
So is your point of departure from Professor Torero that although you agree with him as a matter of principle, you say that the Brigade did embed that degree of flexibility and discretionary command decision making in its procedures and training?
Not enough. So it certainly considered it. Again, what we learned post-Slackle is an example of that. Much of the discretionary decision making piece arose from that incident and others. So I think that the thought was there, the intent was there, the execution needed to be in greater depth.
Now, you may remember also that Professor Torero considered that at the root of what he regarded as a problem was disregard, it's his word, disregard within the sector for technical knowledge, so knowledge and understanding of building behaviour. Do you agree with him that there is or was a tendency to prioritise practical hands-on knowledge or experience at the expense of technical knowledge?
Again, I think it's a nuanced answer. I think the answer is there is certainly a focus at the more junior levels around the practical aspects of responding to an incident, because we know from the thousands of incidents the London Fire Brigade successfully resolves that is a very important part of training. The ability to use kind of recognition primed decision making, repetitive practical skills training is really important. I mean, a prime example, despite the tragedy at Grenfell, was the successful pitching of a 135 ladder by a crew onto the side of the building under enormous pressure. That requires a very important focus on repeated practical training. I think it's clear to me that we did not do enough, however, to expand the knowledge and awareness of firefighters in relation to fire safety in particular, and how that relates to operational practice. And that, again, is something we've addressed with some energy since the fire.
How have you been doing that?
We've trained every single operational firefighter and officer to the first level of fire safety knowledge, and they are now conducting the first level of fire safety audit out in London. So visits to provide advice to businesses and premises, something that hadn't been done since we lost the G visits sort of 20 years before, because in conducting that exercise, one, we're more likely to identify some of the risks apparent in London, and therefore we can escalate them to more specialist officers if we need to. And secondly, by upskilling firefighters and officers in fire safety, we know that they will take some of that knowledge into their operational response as well. And we're not standing still on that. That's a start. We've currently got about 400 people from stations on level 3 accredited courses to be fire safety, the first level of fire safety inspector. And I personally think that all officers based on a fire station should be qualified to level 3, and that's something we will work to get to in the context of investment and capacity to train to at some point.
So can you just help us with where you've got to at the moment? You say you've got 400 people from stations on level 3 accredited courses.
Yeah.
400 out of what? how many station-based staff?
Well, I think this really pertains to officers who've got to lead those visits. So we've got approximately 1,300 station-based officers. I would like to see all of them trained to that level, but that's about their capacity as well to receive a volume of training, frankly, since the first phase of this inquiry and inspection that we need to deliver to them. So we have to bear in mind the capacity of people on that shift system to absorb the training we're giving them, the availability of it, and making sure that they're not overwhelmed by the pace of change as well. So I think it's a position we have to move to over time.
Right. Now, so you've got 1,300, you've done 400. What level of commander are they? Are they crew manager, watch manager, or are they
It'll be
station
watch
manager?
officers, so it's open to leading firefighters, sub-officers and station officers, and by exception firefighters as well, who have some potential.
Right.
So we're trying to build some strength and depth into the organisation, both for the purposes of ensuring better movement between fire safety and operational fire station departments. So, a cross-fertilisation of knowledge and experience that we hope to build over years, recognising, of course, that the tragedy of Grenfell has presented great pressure into the market around available skills of assessors and fire safety inspecting officers because of the very obvious need for them now. So we know we need to grow that knowledge and understanding and potential future inspecting officers from every part of the business.
Two further questions on this particular point. How is that training being delivered? Is it CBT or is it trainer-led, teacher-led?
So it was teacher-led. The first round to all 5,000 staff was a half day, then followed by a full day of training that was teacher-led, delivered to every watch and fire station in London. The professional programme for accreditation at level 3 is a mix of face-to-face learning modules and CBT and accredited learning, and that's externally accredited. So it fits the model of the external accreditation.
And is each candidate assessed?
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, so you would have to pass the appropriate assessment to hold that level of accredited knowledge.
And is there a plan for perhaps already an arrangement in place for refresher training?
Yes, so there'll be refresher training will be part of that, as there is for the very base level of fire safety training we've given officers and crews. Because again, I think one of the lessons we learned from Lacanau and then subsequently for Grenfell is that you need to repeat this learning, it's obvious, on a cycle. So yes.
And I've said there were two questions, there's a third inevitably. Is the content of that training peer reviewed by anybody external from the LFB?
I can't tell you who that is, but yes, because it is externally accredited. And then what I would say is that it will be, firstly, we would show it to the inspectorate. Right. And secondly, we would expect our own independent operation assurance advisor to consider the validity of it as well. So I think there are multiple lines of assurance. I think we would both present it to the inspectorate for their scrutiny and consideration. And again, we've developed this in partnership with colleagues from NFCC. So the standard we're working to is the standard that, again, is understood and has recently been laid out in terms of a competency framework by NFCC. So what we're trying to do really is ensure as many people as possible have eyes on it, because again, I think that's where you get the challenge, and we would, make improvement if required.
Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you very much. I'd like to ask you next about a second interview you did with The Guardian this year, and we have that at INQ 30015080. You can see that the title of this article is Head of London Fire Brigade Says It Must Face Up to Racism and Misogyny. And the date of the article is 19th of March 2021. And we know what the context of this article was. It's in the article, people can read it, but I don't need to take you through that. The first two paragraphs of the article read as follows, just read with me. A culture of casual racism and misogyny remains so prevalent within pockets of the London Fire Brigade that the head of the service said he feared his mixed-race daughter might not be treated with dignity and respect at some fire stations. This workplace culture may explain the poor progression of women and staff from BAME backgrounds to senior positions within the service, according to Andy Rowe, the London Fire Brigade Commissioner, who this week launched a review acknowledging that the Brigade has unresolved problems on race and gender. Now, first, did you say the words, or give the interviewer the gist of the words, at least, attributed to you here?
Yes.
You did. Now, the article refers to you having initiated a review as a result of your concerns. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. So we've commissioned an independent review of culture that's been led by Nazir Asfal.
Right. And what is its current status?
So he was recently appointed to the chair, so I think in the last month. He is beginning to consider how he will gather evidence independently. He's bringing his own team together. And I would suggest for the next 4 or so months he will be he'll be undertaking that process of gathering evidence before he returns to how he might then either amend the terms of reference of the review or expand it further.
Right. Now, you mentioned the terms of reference. I don't think we've seen those. I'm not complaining about it, but are you able to give us the gist of the terms of reference?
Yeah, they're very broad, which is basically to look at every aspect of the London Fire Brigade's culture and every single part of it. So it's not focused on fire stations, it's focused on the entire organisation, from my office to IT, questions of leadership, questions of relationships with staff, empowerment of decision making, issues around protected characteristics, such as this article referred to, so very broad.
And you mentioned the answer before last, the process of gathering evidence. What have you empowered the reviewer to do by way of gathering evidence?
He has complete independence to go to any part of the organisation he sees fit, contact any member of staff he sees fit, to gather that evidence and create a space where he can do so in a way that encourages them to do that, so that they feel safe and confident that the information they provide will be held in confidence and used appropriately.
And when do you expect him to report?
I think it will take approximately a year for him to conduct the review and then report shortly afterwards.
Now, if we turn, please, to page 2 of this article, you can see 4 paragraphs down, it says this: Rowe paid tribute to the kindness and bravery of his colleagues who risk their lives regularly and, quotes, have reached in to rescue people regardless of background, close quotes. But he added, quotes, in my experience, the same people might then come back to the fire station and express themselves casually in racist terms, in misogynist terms, use crude language around faith and sexuality. We're awash with really great people who are really kind and will be there for anyone at their point of crisis. But we still have elements of our culture that we need to transparently face up to and unpick. Again, did you say the words attributed to you there, or give the gist of that?
Yes, I did.
Now, you came up through the station ranks, as you've explained earlier in your evidence. Are you able to give us a concrete example of the kinds of behaviour you yourself have seen which still persist?
Yes. So I can give you an example of when I was a firefighter. We attended a small but very challenging fire in King's Cross involving the Somali community. And we'd found great difficulty in accessing the flat because it was Friday night prayers. The men of the community were at prayer, and it was just women who were there with their children and who initially were very reluctant to let us through the security gates onto an open balcony. And none of us spoke the language. So there were some real challenges in this, but we absolutely persisted. And the firefighter I was part of a crew, and I went into a flat and rescued a young woman, actually, and he conducted himself with utter courage. He's a good BA partner in that, and there was no sense of any kind of different behaviour because this was someone from the Somali community. We were both white men. We then got back on the truck, and as we were driving off, he went, and I won't use all his language, he said, God, those Pakistanis use a vernacular term for that, which I probably wouldn't want to repeat in this setting.
No.
He said, they breed like rabbits. I said, well, I hope so, mate, because I just married one. And there was a sort of tumbleweed moment. But I think that sort of exemplifies kind of the reality of this, which is I don't think race or misogyny plays any part in our response. What I saw that night at Grenfell is not lost on me that 85% of the people who died in that fire were, Londoners from the black or Asian or other ethnic minorities. But what I saw that night was people who put themselves at the most extraordinary risk, without question. You know, firefighters carried out, operating in conditions where they wouldn't even have known the background of the people they were seeking to save because of visibility, etc. That characterises, to me, the day-to-day response of the London Fire Brigade. But what does exist in pockets around the brigade, like many other large, uniformed organisations, are aspects of our culture and behaviour that are not acceptable. You know, that mean that it is not always a safe and dignified workplace. And that's what we need to drive out. That's what we need to examine. They're the difficult questions we need to answer. I genuinely do not believe it is manifest in our response. Because at the point of crisis, I've never seen that. I've only ever seen bravery and endeavour.
So to be clear, are you saying that your observations about discrimination, use a broad term, are not about service outcomes, but about employment conditions?
Broadly, yes. And I think that's not just, again, I would like to say that's why the review of culture is broad. This is not about watch culture. Watches are strong teams, and they need to be. And we don't want to dismantle that. What we want is people to bring their best selves to work and value each other in the creation of those teams. And that actually we need to look at every single part of the organisation to examine questions of whether parts of that culture do impact on our relationship with communities, do impact on our understanding of risk. But in terms of the moment of response, I do not believe it is manifest there at all.
So you know of no cases where firefighters would not rescue a member of the public on the grounds of their sex or gender or their race, or responded less well or less speedily to an incident in an ethnically diverse area or a building occupied by an ethnically diverse occupancy population?
Absolutely not.
No.
And actually, I would stand for every firefighter and officer in the London Fire Brigade to say that I do not believe that is what we do.
Now, let me show you something on the subject of watch culture. Can you please look at LFB 000060350? And I'm showing you this for two reasons, not least because of your last answer about safety. Now, this is a set of training materials relating to fire survival guidance calls. The date that we have for this document from the LFB's disclosure is the 5th of January 2017. And that's the creation date given in the document properties for this document. Now, let's look at page 1, fire survival guidance. And we can scroll through the slides. Go to page 2, please. FSG. And you'll see two images. One is a command unit and the other is a pump. And the definition of FSG is the, I think by now familiar, definition from paragraph 1 of Appendix 3 of Policy 539, at least in its 2011 edition. Now, we go to page 3, and we see this, prompt to check if Mark and Darren are still awake. And there is a photograph under the redaction, not necessary to see the individuals concerned. That's why they've been redacted. Can you tell me what the purpose of that slide would be in apparently an educational slide about fire survival guidance?
I can't, and I've never seen this presentation.
Well, I was going to ask you, that was my next question. You've never seen this presentation?
No.
Let's just scroll through it. 5, FSG, 2 headings, information transfer to the incident, and then resources and mobilisation for FSG calls. And you can see it's pretty basic. It's a pretty basic outline of training about fire survival guidance. Page 5, 3 headings, recording and sharing of information, advice to fire survival guidance callers, and the watch is told control officers will always use the 4 principles of escape, assess, protect, and rescue to provide guidance to FSG callers. And that's a fairly pithy summary of 539. And then communication with control, which is an equally pithy summary of the contents of Policy 790. I think you can take that from me. So far, so good. Slide 6, please. FSG, examples of messages from control and from the incident ground, and I needn't trouble you with the detail of that. And then let's have slide 7 up. A39, Blue Watch, standard night shift. And you can see the image. I'm going to assume, Commissioner, that you've never seen that before.
No, because if I had, it would have not been delivered as a training package. I mean, it's wholly unacceptable.
Well, I was going to ask you that. Does it exemplify the kinds of attitudes you referred to in your March 2021 Guardian interview?
I think it demonstrates a lack of thought about our responsibilities in regard of how we portray ourselves, how we treat each other, about how we understand, how we must make people feel included and valued within an organisation. Because obviously, if you're a woman encountering this training, particularly, I would imagine you would not feel comfortable. You would not feel included. You would not feel that actually this was a kind of a picture that demonstrated any sort of regard to value or dignity.
In January 2017, did the Brigade have an equality, diversity and inclusivity, or EDI, policy, do you think?
We did have policies in relation to that. But again, if we speak to the change that's happened, I took over as Commissioner in January 2020. At that point, we didn't have a fully established cultural change team. We do now. We didn't have a fully established, we didn't have a community engagement team. We're not talking about community advice here. We're talking about people who are going to do the hard miles and answer difficult questions from communities, search out those people who are less comfortable with us and seek to promote understanding and partnership. So there's two examples of how we just didn't even have the people in place to address some of this. So I've got no doubt we had the policies, but there had been a decision taken many years earlier to remove the Equalities Unit that had previously advised the Commissioner then, Ron Dobson. That unit was removed. It was part of the cost savings that were brought to bear over a number of years. I would argue that an organisation our size needs a dedicated team focused on organisational development, cultural change, and ensuring that it acts as a conscience around our very real legal duties in relation to the Equalities Act and other bits of legislation that we are duty bound, and rightfully so, as an organisation to adhere to.
Can you just tell me when the decision had been taken to remove the Equalities Unit that had advised Ron Dobson?
I'm afraid I couldn't. I just remember it was a decision that was made clear to us following a top managers conference many years ago when I was first a station commander. So it may have been 2010, 2011. Right. It had not existed for many, many years.
And what steps are you taking at station level today to eradicate the attitudes that have given rise to this picture?
Well, both in terms of asking the difficult questions no one wants to. That's what the independent review of culture is. This will not be necessarily a comfortable process for the London Fire Brigade, but it's important to do, and we've got to face it head on and then answer those questions. And then rather than waiting for the results, we are engaged on a programme of mass education. So, as we speak, cultural awareness workshops are taking place on fire stations, and not, what I think has been in the past a kind of tired model of explaining, religious faith or difference, but actually real conversations that best support what I think are on the whole dedicated public servants to kind of challenge their own behaviours, think about where they've come from, understand the tension between different generations, really recognise the communities they serve. So that's happening now, and it is aligned directly with the leadership programme, which must be inextricably linked to it, because values and behaviours have to sit at the heart of leadership, and that relates directly, of course, to these questions and matters as well.
I said there were two aspects to this. Are you able to tell us why this kind of image was prepared for a presentation to firefighters, presumably A39 Blue Watch, at all, let alone as part of an LFB training package, let alone a training package on FSG calls, of all things?
No, I think it speaks to an unthinking culture. I doubt the person who did this thought they were doing any harm.
But it's more than unthinking, isn't it, Commissioner? Would you agree with that? Quite apart from the offensive signifier of unacceptable attitudes, it belittles and trivialises fire survival guidance and the control room's work, and so tends to undermine public safety.
I don't know if I can extrapolate as much as that from it. All I know is it is a wholly inappropriate image that I would not expect to be delivered as part of a professional training package. What it speaks to in greater part to me is a lack of professional kind of delivery of training. That's of a greater concern to me. I think it's a poor attempt at humour I would imagine, and it's been done in an unthinking way. And actually, that speaks somewhat to the heart of the issues I hope we are addressing, which is, let me speak plainly. I'm a South London lad. I've come up and through boxing clubs, the army, the fire brigade. I have worked with a lot of really decent people who did not hold politically correct views, who were, can I put it, rough around the edges. Given the opportunity to have a conversation and receive some good education, those people very often shifted their views and their behaviours because they were inherently decent people. But we just have not offered them the benefit of that education for many, many, many years. So as much as I recognise this is wholly unacceptable, I do not think we have best served and supported firefighters in the past to actually help people understand why, although you think that's funny, and if you're in a group of men together who've served together for 15 years, it might feel acceptable. Actually, if you're someone new coming onto that watch or into a team in headquarters, it may not feel like that. It's about that process of education to make people really understand what inclusion means. It's all very well diversifying an organisation, but people have got to feel included and valued when they arrive. My experience of firefighters, so that Guardian article, to be frank, is one of the single most contentious things I've done as a commissioner. I visit fire stations a lot, and it is invariably the first subject that arises, and we very often have a long and detailed conversation about it with people who feel very uncomfortable about what I've said, but by the end of the conversation, recognise that there's a truth to it, that there needs to be a balance in these things, and that they need to come on that journey with us if we want to be a fire service that really serves, all the many communities of this extraordinary city.
And going back to the point about fire survival guidance, would you accept that perhaps of equal importance is the need to make sure that frontline firefighters understand the importance of fire survival guidance as a function?
Can I just say that I don't think you can extrapolate that meaning from this slide, because actually my experience, again, having experienced fire survival guidance calls in an operational setting as a firefighter and then officer, is that it's when you get that on the call slip, you are racing to get there quicker. I think firefighters and officers take fire survival guidance very, very seriously because they know that people could potentially die if we don't get there quickly enough and make the right intervention. So I don't think it's a question of colleagues not taking fire survival guidance seriously. What I think it speaks to is a lack of good behaviour and appropriate standards when delivering training, and says something about kind of the professional approach to training that I would expect as a baseline standard, which clearly that does not represent.
Yes, a convenient moment.
Is that a convenient moment, Mr. Chairman?
Yeah, certainly. Yes. Well, we said we'd have a break during the afternoon, Commissioner, and we'll have it now. We'll come back and continue, please, at 20 to 4. And I have to ask you, as I have all the other witnesses, please don't discuss your evidence or anything relating to it with anyone when they're out of the room. All right?
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. Would you like to go to the ushers?
Thank you.
Thank you. 20 to 4, please. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman.
Would you ask the Commissioner to come back in, please? Thank you. Right, Commissioner, all ready to carry on?
I am, thank you.
Good, thank you very much. Yes, Mr.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Commissioner, what I'm going to do next is ask you about some of the aspects of the material that has emerged through the inquiry in Module 5 and the first part of Module 6. And we're very interested in your take, as it were, on specific points and how they have come to pass and what the LFB is going to do about it or is doing about it now. And the first topic is translation of knowledge of risks of cladding into operational practice. First, Lacanau. Can we go, please, to LFB 001-23263? LFB 001-23263. This is the Module 6 written opening statement provided by you, or at least on your behalf, to the inquiry a few weeks ago. Take a moment to look at the first page, and we can look at much more of it if you like. But did you read it, do you think, before it was filed with the inquiry?
Yes, definitely.
You did?
Yes.
Good. Can we go to page 2, please? Paragraph 4, from the top line on page 2, where it says, the LFC respectfully suggests that caution must be exercised before concluding that all previous incidents presented learning opportunities relevant to Grenfell Tower which were missed. And then you give an example of Madingley House. And then you go on, while it is fully accepted by the LFC that there were multiple lessons from the Lacanau House fire that had to be learned and acted upon, the most significant issue and learning point in terms of fire spread was the internal compartmentation failure of the building. The nature and extent of the external flame spread over the exterior surface of the building was not itself unusual, although spandrel panels caused secondary fires on lower floors by reason of melting material falling into open windows. Can you explain whether that text means that this is how the learning points arising from the Lacanau fire were perceived internally?
Yes, I think the greatest focus was on the failure of internal compartmentation, how the complex layout of the building had hampered operational firefighters' response. You know, it was what was known as a scissor block, and that the exterior fire spread had been caused really by the failure of UPVC units. So they were the major learning points, with some acceptance that external fire spread had occurred through a number of different methods, including some by the spandrel panels.
Does that tell us that for the LFB at the time, the fire had primarily highlighted risks around compartmentation failure, but not so much, or perhaps not at all, in relation to combustible facade panels?
I think the emphasis wasn't on combustible facade panels, but what the big summary lesson that we took away from Lacanau was that buildings might behave in a way you didn't expect when you first encountered them. And that you couldn't rely in totality that building would operate safely as it was intended to within the context of a regulatory regime.
So, just unpicking that answer, the big lesson, could one put that a different way, namely that the assumption that the building complied with the building regulations was an unsound assumption?
Yes, you couldn't rely in totality on that. That whilst as a fire and rescue service, you know, the national framework itself says that fire and rescue services should only reasonably plan their use of resources and their focus of training on matters that sit within the regulatory frameworks, because that's an appropriate use of public resource. But obviously, a separate duty of a fire and rescue service is to recognise that their very existence is because parts of those regulatory regimes might fail. And Lacanau showed us that.
Yes.
It showed us that in some part, you could not rely in totality on either constructors, those who manage buildings, nor inspectors to do their job entirely competently. Otherwise, we wouldn't have taken the kind of level of legal action we then took against Southwark Council.
Yes. Coming back to the point, a slightly different way of looking at it, looking back at Lacanau and the learning directed at it, was Lacanau regarded as a compartmentation incident rather than a combustible facade incident?
I can speak in two parts. One, because as Commissioner, I think it's my job to look back and try and understand what happened in the past so that perhaps we we improve in a different way in the future. And then from my own personal experience as a station commander at the time. So as a station commander at the time, the way I experienced the Lakanal House case study, actually the learning from local colleagues, because I was a station commander in Southwark at the time, was that this was not just about internal compartmentation. That what that case study showed me was that buildings could begin to fail in ways that were unexpected, and then if you had a complex layout, you would have to think very, very carefully about how you both got to residents and maintained the safety of firefighters. I think it taught us lessons about the volume of fire survival guidance that might come in and how we might deal with that. And indeed, we saw developments in policy, procedures and equipment available for firefighters that recognise that. So I think it was much bigger than just a focus on internal compartmentation. There was a sense, it was a very significant fire for the London Fire Brigade. It sent a shock through the brigade. You know, there would not have been an officer or firefighter that wasn't aware of it because of the scale of loss of life and what looked like, a really challenging failure of a building. So it was more, the takeaway was more the kind of multiple aspects of failure, actually.
In the last sentence I've just read to you, which starts, the nature and extent of the external flame spread was not in itself unusual, etc. Is it the case that this was the perceived extent of the fire risk posed by the facade panels at Lakanal? In other words, was the learning point that the LFB took from the fire was that it was external fire spread, and no more than an awareness of the risk that a facade panel may catch light and cause fires on lower floors?
I think it was a combination of all of those things. What I took away from it, and having looked back at what was presented then to our operational crews and officers, it chimes with what I experienced, which was this showed that you could have elements of a building that might fail, for example, the window frames, and contribute to external fire spread, that there were panel materials used in buildings that could contribute to fire spread, although not in a way that we subsequently have understood, post-Grenfell, and that combined with poor management of a building, so very poor renovation work, meant that it was riven with voids, and that the combination of external and internal fire spread would represent a really serious challenge. I think that was how I certainly experienced it at the time and understood it, that there could be an element of external fire spread, right, that there could be an element of really significant failure of internal compartmentation. And I remember talking about it with colleagues and thinking about what were the sorts of things that might cause internal compartmentation failure, for example. So poorly run replacement utilities, the wrong approach to cabling, lack of internal fire barriers. So we talked about it in that way, but it was also one of the first times I think I'd heard such a direct reference, for example, to the possibility of UPVC frames failing on a scale and contributing to external fire spread as well. So I think it brought a lot of learning into the operational environment.
Can I ask you please to look at LFB 00104291? Now, this is a letter of the 14th of December 2009 from the LFB to Ken Knight. I should ask you first, are you familiar with this letter?
I'm not familiar with it, other than it may well have been in one of my bundles for this, but there's about 4,000 pages in there, so I can't quite remember whether I've read this one or not.
Okay, let's look at the key parts of it. The first paragraph says this: Dear Sir Ken, I'm writing to inform you that as part of our investigation into the fire at Lakanal House, Scow Gardens, Southwark, on 3rd July 2009, we have had tests carried out on the exterior wall panels of the building, and that those tests have given rise to concerns which may well be relevant to other high-rise premises. Although our investigations are continuing and the matter has still to come before the coroner, I feel that it is in the public interest to draw the issue to your attention so that the matter can be discussed within the department and any necessary advice can be given to owners and landlords of high-rise buildings. Now, if we skip then down to the third and fourth paragraphs on page 1, we can see that Mr. Dobson set out the functional requirements of ADB and the building regulations, section B4 of the building regulations. And then on page 2, third and fourth and fifth paragraphs down, you'll see he said this. Based on the tests conducted by the Building Research Establishment, it appears that there are external wall panels at Lacknell House that do not have the necessary reaction to fire properties required for the location in which they have been used. We have also become aware that this type of panel has been supplied by more than one company. In the circumstances, we believe it may be appropriate for a warning to be given to housing providers that it would be advisable to check the specification for external wall panels in their high-rise housing stock and check that what has been installed meets the correct specification, i.e., that fire safety requirements of the building regulations were taken into account, and to include this in fire risk assessments for relevant properties. Now, would you agree with me that this letter shows that at an early stage of the LFB's post-Lacknell investigations, the LFB was aware that external fire spread had been facilitated, at least in part, at Lacknell by non-compliant panels on the outside of the building?
Yes, absolutely. I think the letter is clear in that.
And that those panels, having been supplied by more than one company, created a situation unlikely to be confined to Lacknell House.
Yes.
And so serious was the problem that the then Commissioner thought it proper to ask the government to step in and warn housing providers to check the specification for external wall panels in their high-rise stock and make sure it was compliant with the building regulations and approved Document B.
Yes, I think it's absolutely clear in that letter.
Now, I put to you really an interpretation of that letter. The next question is that warning and the content of that warning something that you were aware of at any time up to the Lacknell House, up to the Grenfell Tower fire?
Not in that level of detail, no.
Right.
So certainly that there was a possibility of external fire spread in the way we saw at Lacknell, because that did indeed form part of the case study and the learning that arose from it and that I had received. But not in the way that it is articulated in that letter.
Right.
No.
Even the sense of what is articulated in this letter, was that something that you had a sense of from the time of the Lacknell House fire, given what you knew about it?
Not to that level of detail. I mean, my own professional interest had meant that I was aware that there had been cladding fires in the news, for example, in Dubai and other places. And I'd certainly encountered fires where all sorts of different materials had contributed to some form of external fire spread. I think it's disingenuous to pretend that that was something that the London Fire Brigade hadn't previously encountered in lots of different settings, but not obviously on the scale we saw at Grenfell, and not articulated in the way that is laid out in this letter.
Right. Can we go back then to the written opening, which we looked at a moment ago, LFB 123263, paragraph 4 on page 2, where in the last 3 lines you say the nature and extent of the external flame spread over the exterior surface of the building was not itself unusual. Doesn't the fact that the exterior panels were subsequently found not to be compliant with the building regulations make the nature of the flame spread at least unusual?
I don't think it means that it was necessarily unusual, because, as I said, I think it would be disingenuous to say that we hadn't experienced some form of external fire spread in other situations before. And actually, if you look at the Lacknell House fire, even the photos post-fire, you'll see that whilst there is external fire spread, the greater issue, and I'd seen the inside of the block, it was the internal failure of compartmentation. It was a complete burnout on the levels involved. So I'm not sure that it represented something wholly unusual, but it is of interest to me that that letter existed in 2009, speaking to the concerns of the then Commissioner as to what might have been an industry-wide issue that could contribute to, other fires and significant external fire spread.
Yes. Now, I don't think the opening statement refers to the fact that after Lacknell, the LFB had, as we can see, and I suggest from this letter, identified that the spandrel panels had caught fire and were not compliant, or the fact that the brigade was sufficiently concerned about it to write to the then CFRA, Ken Knight. Is it right, do you accept, sitting there today, that the Lacknell House fire presented a learning opportunity, not just in relation to internal compartmentation, but critically in relation to the concerns that the LFB clearly had at the time about non-compliant combustible materials on use on the exterior of buildings across London?
I think in light of that letter, I would accept that, because it's very clear in the way it is written that that was a risk that had been considered at that point.
Are you able, from what you now know, sitting here today, why the risk identified in Ron Dobson's letter of the 14th of December 2009 to Sir Ken Knight appears, tell me if this is wrong, appears not to have been fed through to frontline staff after Lakanal?
I think it goes back to a point I made earlier, which is we had an effective fire safety department that was actually quite good at identifying risks, recognising challenges in the built environment, but they were not integrated fully enough into the operational delivery of the London Fire Brigade. I'm afraid I think they at times acted in a silo, and that actually much of my effort over the past 2 years of my officers has been to ensure that we integrate, and we have an integrated understanding of what delivery means, because I see our fire safety inspectors, our school teams, our control officers, even our digital officers, and our firefighters as being on the front line, because they are all interfacing with the public on a daily basis, and therefore they all hold pieces of information that help us build a composite understanding of risk in the capital, and therefore they all need to have the same knowledge as the other party has, and that's really what we've been engaged in, trying to put in place those systems and processes that drive that commonality of understanding and sharing of knowledge. Now,
I posed you a question. It might be said, well, what about the Lakanal case study? And we'll look at that in a moment. But before we do, I want to show you what the LFB's Lakanal Assurance Report said. And you'll remember that that report was produced on the 7th of August 2018 in the middle of phase 1 of this inquiry. Can we go to that? It's at LFB 0004801. And you can see the front page there on your screen, Commissioner.
Yep.
And if we go to page 29 in the document, we can see Action 3C on the right-hand side, introduce a case study training package incorporating learning outcomes from inquests. And that arises out of the coroner's third recommendation, which is set out on the previous page, page 28. If we go back to that, in the middle of the right-hand column, there's the recommendation, number 3, relating to incident commanders. And in summary, it relates to the training of incident commanders in specific matters that were identified by the coroner as learning points from the incident. And if you look down the list of bullet points, you can see the third bullet point there, which says, to anticipate that a fire might behave in a manner inconsistent with the compartmentation principle. Now, if we get back to page 29 and Action 3C there, we can see that the assurance review continues as under the red text in smaller black text. A computer-based training CBT solution. The Lakanal House case study was developed to cover the learning outcomes from the Lakanal House inquests. The specified learning outcomes for the case study incorporated both the coroner's recommendations above and the relevant training recommendations from the Brigade's operational review report. All watches completed the case study training package as station-based training. Senior officers were invited to attend one of a series of Lakanal House training presentations where the case study was delivered by a senior officer who had been closely involved in the Lakanal House investigation. Now, to be clear, I think it's right, isn't it, that you had no personal involvement in the development or the implementation of the Lakanal House case study?
No, not at all.
You were, I think, an operational officer in 2009. Did you undertake the study yourself? Do you remember?
Yes, I remember it. I remember receiving it. I just couldn't tell you where or who delivered it, but I do remember it because I remember it as some learning that I thought was really significant. You know, and again, that might have been particularly because I was serving in Southwark at the time, and I had close contact frequently with watch officers who'd attended the fire. I had a guy called Chris Payton, who was a watch officer working to me, who'd been profoundly affected by the fire. You know, was really interested in seeing how the brigade was going to change as a result. You know, he had a personal interest. We used to talk about it quite a lot. And another chap called Matt Rosendale, who was a watch officer on the Green Watch at Brixton at the time, I think, who again had a real personal interest and attended the fire, I believe. So it was the subject of discussion. We talked about it quite a lot in the borough.
Right. The packages, just for your chronological interest, were rolled out to station-based staff and senior officers in August 2014. We've seen those already with former Commissioner Danny Cotton and also Gary Reason, who was the then Director of Operations, Resilience and Training. And I don't need to go back over that ground with you, unless, of course, there's anything you would like me to show you in it. What I do want to do is ask you about the absence from that package of reference to external panels or facade fires, or indeed fire behaviour that is inconsistent with the compartmentation principle, including rapid internal fire and smoke spread beyond the compartment of origin. Now, we asked Annie Cotton about the gaps in the package, and although she didn't have specific knowledge of the package or involvement in its development, she did accept that the team that developed the package should have used the exercise as a better opportunity to explore the issues I've just referred to. And she did that at day 109, page 37, lines 10 to 15. That's for our reference. Now, it's a long question, I'm afraid, but do you agree with what I've put to you? Principally, that the team that developed it should have used the exercise as an opportunity better to explore the areas where there are gaps.
Because I can't recall in entirety the package, I can't see it in my head now. I think it's difficult to speak to all of the detail, but the letter you showed me previously, demonstrates that we knew about a risk in relation to external cladding that I would have expected to be reflected if one part of the organisation had known about it in that training package. So it may not be, this may be another example of not so much the team that put the package together, but the fact that we had not made all the information available to that team. That would be my suspicion at that point. And that would have been a missed opportunity, yes.
So does it come as a surprise to you, or as a matter of dismay to you, that the training package developed after Lacanal, the case study, ostensibly as a means of addressing the learning points arising out of that incident, omitted entirely any mention of the key features of that fire I've described?
Without looking at the case, without looking at the course notes that sit underneath whatever slides the presentation, perhaps it might be worth taking me to that. Would that be possible?
Well, it would be possible. But we could do that. We've got the notes.
The only reason I asked Mr. Millett is because I think it's difficult for me because I was based in Southwark. I remember the fire. I remember the fire having a profound impact on the brigade, and I remember what I took from the fire.
Right. Well, let's try that.
Yeah, so what I took from the fire was that buildings might react in a way you did not expect, that you almost certainly could experience unexpected failure of internal compartmentation, that you shouldn't take as read when you turned up at a block, that what you thought the layout might be would be the layout. There's a lot of focus on the layout of the block, scissor blocks, where you might have to make access at a higher point to get to a lower point. The effects of travelling smoke and combustion. These are the things I remember from it, and I remember the pictures in the PowerPoint and thinking that looks like a really unusual fire spread as well. Sort of diagonal, not vertical. It was unexpected. So what I took from that presentation was that buildings might not behave the way you thought they might, that you couldn't rely on the construction to act as it should have done, that you had to be very aware of complex layouts when you were committing firefighters into an incident involving, a residential block of that kind. And actually, I do remember particularly the issue of the windows for some reason. So these are the things that I remember in particular.
Yes. Let's see if we can get this in a slightly different way, because I'm not going to cover the same ground we've covered with other senior witnesses. Do you accept this proposition that the Lacanal case study should have addressed the failure of compartmentation on a widespread scale and the question of external fire spread?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, indisputably, because they were both critical factors in that fire. And if we knew about it in one part of the organisation and hadn't shared the full detail of that, and that wasn't expressed in the presentation, that itself was a missed opportunity.
Yes. And would you also agree that if it omitted any reference to the fact that there had been fire spread as a result of non-compliant facade panels, that was also a failure to learn a lesson?
Yes, absolutely.
Can I then turn to GRA 3.2 and Policy 633 and cladding? Now, we've heard at some length from earlier witnesses in this module, namely Peter Cowap and Patrick Utting, about the process by which both GRA 3.2 and Policy 633 were developed and drafted in the period 2010 to 14 for GRA 3.2 and 2013 to 15, I think, for Policy 633. Now, I'm not going to ask you about specific drafting points, Commissioner. I have a more basic question, and it's this. Do you agree that, bearing in mind the LFB's own Lacanal investigations and the findings in relation to panels, as we saw communicated by Commissioner Ron Dobson to Sir Ken Knight in the December 2009 letter we've just looked at, the risk of cladding fires was a matter that should have been identified by the Brigade, both in its own work on the revision of GRA 3.2 and its amendment of its own high-rise firefighting policy 633?
Yes, because it was clear that was a risk factor, and it should have been included within the risk assessment that underpinned the GRA.
Now, we've seen from earlier versions of GRA 3.2, particularly the 2008 version, which was the edition immediately before that of February 2014, that cladding, or risks of cladding, were referred to in that building as something that may promote abnormal or rapid fire spread. Do you know why cladding had been identified in the national guidance, the GRA, as far back as 2008?
Do I know why?
Yes.
No, I don't.
You don't?
I wasn't part of that process.
Did you know at any time before June 2017 that one reason why cladding systems were referred to was because there had been a pre-existing history of cladding fires in the United Kingdom, notably, perhaps most notably, the Knowsley Heights fire in 1991 and the fire at Garnet Court in 1999?
So I was aware of Garnet Court, not the other fire you just referred to. I was certainly aware that but again, it's hard sometimes to separate out your own professional interests from what you've been told over a very long career. I certainly wasn't aware until later years that was referenced within the national GRA.
Right. Now, neither Mr. Carp nor Mr. Utting were able to explain in any detail, at least, how or why LFB's Policy 633 omitted any reference to cladding, notwithstanding the express reference, as we saw in at least the February 2014 version of GRA 3.2. Are you able to explain how it came about that the LFB simply hadn't grasped, despite Lacanal, the fact that cladding was a known risk and needed to be addressed in policy and training?
No, I can't, and clearly it shouldn't have been omitted from our own policy.
Now, I think from an exchange you had with the chairman earlier, you would also accept that the risk of cladding systems posing a risk of rapid and abnormal fire spread was something that was on Ron Dobson's radar, but also from the fire safety department's perspective, given the existence by at least July 2016 of the tall buildings facade slideshow.
Yes, I would accept that. It was known in various parts of the organisation, even if it hadn't been communicated effectively to the front line.
Yes, and I think you've already covered this a little bit, but do you accept that, or do you have any insight into why it was, or how it came about that the knowledge about those matters held in certain parts of the Brigade hadn't filtered through to the departments responsible for the development of guidance and policy following Lacanal?
I think if I think about it in the context of my role now and what we've changed, I think a lot of this falls to the governance we had in place. So, for example, individual directorate boards that sat as a directorate board, almost in a silo, whereas now we have cross-cutting boards that involve all directors, for example. I think processes that need to be explicitly in place to gather information from every single part of the organisation and a team dedicated to do so. So I think much of this is about system and governance. and just being clear that if we are going to continue to be a learning organisation as we aspire to be, that we continue to improve, we have to explicitly put in place frameworks and processes that enable that information to be lifted from different parts of the organisation and communicated as a matter of course.
Right. So let's just break that up a bit. Cross-cutting boards, it's something you referred to in your answer. What is that?
So, for example, when I took the London Fire Brigade over in January 2020, we had boards that sat chaired by the individual director with their heads of service that related only to the business within that directorate. So whether that was operations or corporate services, and where we've gone to now is a place where we have generic cross-cutting boards, as exists in lots of other organisations like the NHS or local authorities. So, for example, we have a people board which deals with all matters related to HR, people, development of our people, health and safety. All directors sit on that, and all the relevant heads of service who need to bring forward decisions into that environment will come to that board. It means that directors have to share information from inside their own directorates with other directors and be challenged before they arrive at a recommendation for decision to bring to me. By establishing a research and development function, which at the moment is purely focused on operational risk but is actually likely to expand, that team's job is to proactively search in those departments most likely to hold the information around emerging risk, and then bring it in to the operations board, for example, which again involves all the directors sitting on it and hearing to matters of risk and therefore what mitigation we might bring to bear on it.
Right. So, just so I can understand that better, I mean, take the example of the risk of rapid and abnormal fire spread presented by modern methods of construction, materials, cladding. Where would that question sit? Who would address that using your cross-cutting board system?
It depends where it arose. I mean, and this is the point. So I think it falls ultimately to the Director of Operations to take that responsibility, because that individual has the span of the operational information gathering, available to them. So if it arose in fire safety, I would expect, as a matter of course, the individual running fire safety to make that identification of a new risk clear to their directorate to be considered as part of the risk management process we've now got in place. So we now have a detailed risk management process in place that ranges from an understanding of tactical risk up to the strategic. And I would expect it to be exposed through the application of that risk management process across all areas of the business. And if we're talking specifically about operations, if I'm the head of fire safety, and a good example would be the growing understanding of the risk around battery technology. So we're starting to see fires involving electric scooters, which are presenting a risk on the London Underground, quite specific risk, but that has been identified through post-fire analysis as to the cause of the fire. It's been escalated within the fire safety department. It is now recorded on their departmental risk register. Because you can see that this is a bit of technology that's expanding at a rate of knots, that's now been brought into the directorate board to then ask back down the other way, well, colleagues in operational policy, are you aware of this? What are we doing? Have we even got the capacity to start to plan procedural change? Is there an immediate safety note that needs to go out, for example? So I think it's all about joining up the different bits of information. I think that's perhaps where the greatest kind of change can be brought to ensure that we don't find ourselves in a position where I'm looking at a letter from 2009 that reasonably should have informed the presentation we gave operational crews and officers.
Yes, that's helpful. I mean, we've been able to put together a number of structure charts, which may or may not be correct, in the course of our investigations, which I'm not going to share with you. But presumably you would be in a position, would you, at the end of this module, when your council closes, to be able to provide us with a detailed structure chart to show the changes?
Indeed, and it's fundamental change. So we've gone, we've evolved continuously. So we have 5 directorates sitting across areas of strategic priority. So we have a transformation directorate, a people directorate, dealing with matters of people, culture, HR, health and safety, etc. Operations, finance and corporate services, and then something that's really a department, but is important if we think about the credibility and reputation of the brigade, communications. So those are our directors and directorate responsibilities, and they all sit in cross-cutting boards so that you don't lose any one part of those priorities when you're making decisions. And I think that's not unusual to many organisations. It's just something we hadn't properly embedded in governance previously in the London Fire Brigade.
Now, have you, I'm going to try this differently, the redesigning of governance that you've been describing in the last 5 minutes or so, Commissioner, is that design something that's come from within the brigade, or is that something on which you've taken external professional advice?
No, we've taken considerable external professional advice, because when I took over in January 2020, what was immediately clear to me was that for all the fantastic public servants we employ, people who are just prepared to put themselves at risk repeatedly on a day-to-day basis, we have been somewhat inward-looking, and that our structures, even to me, and I would include myself as somewhat uneducated at that point, did not feel particularly modern. So we brought in professionalism, skills and capability at director level. So, for example, we employed, our Director of Transformation was previously the Director of Transformation at Network Rail. My Director of People previously ran an NHS trust, and was head of people at an NHS trust before that. Our Director of Communications has worked across government and policing, for example. So, and we haven't sort of rested there. The creation of an independent audit committee is particularly important, chaired again by really experienced people from the private and public sector, who provide independent, external advice to me on issues that refer to best practice as experienced elsewhere. The frameworks we've built around risk management and business assurance are based on models employed elsewhere in government and industry. So I think we've really embarked over the past 2 years on a desire to look outwards from ourselves and kind of seek to learn from other organisations and bring into the brigade practices that really kind of give good faith to the covenant I think we owe with our firefighters in particular, who put themselves at risk every day. I think that's what they deserve. I think we owe it to ourselves to do that.
And in those efforts, have you found yourself able to carry people with you, or have you found a degree of resistance in certain corners of the organisation?
A mix. I think fundamental change is always really difficult, particularly in an organisation where perhaps there hasn't been that level of external scrutiny previously that the Inspectorate has now brought to the fire and rescue sector, where people are very used to the orthodoxies of doing what they've always done. So I think at times it has been difficult for people to experience that change. And I have to say, transparently, I don't think we've always effectively communicated it. If I was to mark my own scorecard from the past 2 years, I think something we need to improve on, because I don't think we've been effective, is our internal communication, our empowerment of officers to communicate that change positively. And it's an area we're really kind of working on. I think it's been an enormous process of learning that will never end if we really consider ourselves to be one of the great London institutions.
And who is responsible for carrying into full effect, ensuring that there is carried into full effect, the observations and recommendations of the HMICFRS reports and also the independent audit committee you've referred to?
Well, ultimately me, because I'm a corporate soul. So I hold the ultimate responsibility on behalf of London and Londoners to deliver them a service they deserve. So I think the buck stops with me. In terms of the organisation itself, it's my Director of Transformation is responsible for liaison and analysis of Her Majesty's Inspectorate's recommendations. And because she does not hold responsibility for delivery, actually she's the first kind of objective line of assurance outside of line management delivery internally as well. So she's there to assure our progress against those recommendations. Andy Bell, who I know is well known to the inquiry, has that responsibility as Assistant Commissioner working to that director to both bring together the recommendations from phase 1 of this inquiry alongside the recommendations arising from inspection, which together total in fact 66 in number, and which we accept in completeness. and it is his job rigorously to interrogate other parts of the organisation as to our progress and our ability to sustain that change. That is a never-ending process, and it ebbs and it flows. But I think the intent is very clear.
Who is the Director of Transformation?
It's Fiona Dolman.
And what's her background?
She came from Network Rail. She was in a very senior position in Network Rail, responsible for change and transformation, so a transformation specialist.
Yes, and sorry, I don't think we've seen a record of it. Is it Dolman?
Dolman, Dolman.
Thank you.
But I think we could usefully supply you with the current structure charts of the brigade and perhaps a summary of the changes that have evolved over the past 2 years, because actually, as we've learnt more, that they haven't remained static. I think we've been on a journey really of understanding how to operate effectively at a corporate level. I can certainly reflect on that personally. It's been an enormous learning for me to start at the point I did in January 2020 to get to where I am now. And I certainly didn't know what I know now when I took the post, and I continue to learn. I think it's an enormously challenging position, whether it's me or my predecessors, and that you cannot be complacent enough to think you have all the answers. I think you've got to constantly seek to improve both yourself and the organisation.
And coming back to one of the questions that I directed at you at the very beginning of your evidence but didn't want an answer to, as part of the process you've been describing, Commissioner, have you been asking yourself or directed others who are charged with change in the brigade to ask themselves not just how we can learn the lessons of Grenfell, but why we never learned the lessons of Lakanal?
Yes, we've gone back and looked at it, because there is a lesson in that, because I recognise, having been in the brigade at the time, that there was genuine intent from the leadership. Ron Dobson, I don't know how it was communicated, but I can only tell you what I experienced, but I'm fairly sure he put out messages around it. There was a very strong sense in the brigade that this had been the most awful tragedy that had impacted the most vulnerable in society once again, and that there was a great intent to drive change and learn from it. To find all these years later that change had not been sustained in every aspect and not all of the lessons had been captured, I think will be heartbreaking for some of the firefighters who are involved in that particular fire. So it would be remiss not to turn back to Lakanal and ask those general questions of when something significant happens. It's not necessarily about unpicking every detail of Lakanal, but it's that challenge to ourselves, which is when something significant happens, whether it's Grenfell 7-7, the tram crash, Lakanal, how do we capture the learning and certainly deliver improvement? But more importantly, and to be fair, this is the challenge of the inspectorate to me as well, they've been very clear, is how do you sustain that generationally? How do you continue to embed that change? How do you build upon it? Because if I was to focus on something, I think, as a result of Lakanal, we didn't do effectively, it was to sustain that learning. And we cannot afford to do that again, certainly not in the face of a tragedy of this scale.
And you may already have provided the answer to this next question in that last answer, but are you able to tell us what the answer to the question is, why the brigade never learnt the lessons of Lakanal?
I don't think there's any one factor that there's not a simple answer to say why. I think it's a mixture of a governance that didn't encourage working beyond departmental or directorate walls, so actually the structures themselves. I think sometimes something in our culture around looking in rather than facing challenge out. I think an erosion of professional standards, not just in the brigade, but nationally, that had occurred over many years. I think the challenge of, to be fair to previous commissioners, managing repeated industrial disputes that sucked enormous energy and were so damaging in the context of relationships between officers and frontline crews, and therefore meant even gathering the learning quite difficult, I think. So I think it's multi-layered. I think it's in the culture, I think it's in the systems, I think it's in the governance, and I think it was slow, it was incremental, and it sometimes happened without people probably being aware that it was happening until we got to this most awful endpoint.
Thank you, Commissioner. Mr. Chairman, is that a convenient moment?
Yes, I think it is, if that suits you as well.
It's a little bit
Thank
early.
you very much. That doesn't matter.
Good progress.
Commissioner, I think that's a good point at which we'll end for the day. So we'll stop there. We'll resume, please, at 10 o'clock tomorrow. I think you were expecting to come tomorrow, weren't you, in any event?
Yes, absolutely.
Yes, good. So 10 o'clock tomorrow, and in the meantime, please resist the temptation, if it presents itself, to talk to other people about your evidence or anything relating to it. All right?
Thank you, sir. Thank you, panel. Thank you, Mr. Miller.
Thank you very much, and if you go with the usher, she'll look after you. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Millett. 10 o'clock tomorrow then, please.
Mr. Chairman, thank you.